we can start discussing the last point of this this conference, which is what you consider might be other solutions in this situation. I know we've discussed this a bit before in the video conference, but I think that right now is the opportunity to discuss it maybe a bit more in length.
Fundamentally, I think the idea that the only way to improve the human rights situation in production, for example, in palm oil, is to use the market. Now, that is a kind of fundamental shift that's happened in the perspective of governments, social movements, civil society, for maybe in the last 20 years. Now, I'm just going to give you an example to show how ridiculous this idea is. When the labor movement enforced the 8-hour day, in the 20th century, in 19th 20th century, they did not. Their strategy was not, okay, let's ask the companies to do it, out of their own free will, and we'll put pressure on them by only buying commodities where the workers have an 8-hour day. That isn't how it happened. It was a big social movement, labor, and it was based on shifting the fundamental power relations within society, and it was and so the strategy was, we need political regulation, to enforce this. Now, what's wrong with that kind of strategy? That, for me, is a perfectly normal way of organizing and campaigning. And I think what's happened now is, it's good that NGOs have started picking up on the labor issue in the palm oil industry, and don't just talk about environmental issues, which are also important. But what's happened is that they've basically copied the same consumer-based campaigning strategy, which is focus on the brand, get into cooperation with the high level of that corporation, and then ask them to improve their standards. Now, this is really asking the exploiters to try and stop exploiting, which is, it's basically not really in their nature, or it's against their sort of business model. They can't. It's basically impossible. So I think Eric's already spoken about this strategy, but I think the key thing is really to support labor as an organized force in Indonesia, in Malaysia, but this has to be done in a kind of horizontal way, which also means that the labor movement in the US, in Canada, in Europe, has to start becoming more transnational in their strategy.
So I couldn't agree more with that. I don't know if you all have. I recently published a short article in something called the New Labor Forum, where I actually make exactly this point. I think where I say, what we need are independent trade unions in the Indonesian and Malaysian palm sectors, that we can be sure with organized trade unions that they will have the interest to the direct economic interest to bargain with the palm oil industry over wages and working conditions. And as a social NGO, I do take Oliver's point that, and I'm very careful. Like, I don't speak I don't speak for Indonesian workers. I don't speak for Malaysian, or I don't speak for migrant workers in Malaysia. I try to be very careful when I'm talking to NGOs, when I'm talking to companies. I always make that point. We do work closely with Indonesian labor unions and NGOs, the independent ones, because in Indonesia, unfortunately, many trade unions on palm plantations are They are the legacy unions from the Suharto era. They are not independent. They are controlled by management. They do not bargain with the company in a meaningful way. And that's why you will see in Indonesia, many of these plantations have a nominal trade union presence. But if you look at wages and working conditions, they are no better than they would be at any other plantation. That is the surest sign that that trade union is not authentic. It is a company-controlled trade union. But I will say that the reason that, to Oliver's point of this market engagement, consumer engagement, I do agree that there are very, very real limits in the ability of what's NGOs and market campaigners can achieve through this model of pressure. I absolutely agree with that. We use it because we find that it is one of the only tools that we have available to us, since we cannot, I cannot create independent trade unions in Indonesia. I have a lot of powers, but that is not one of them. But I will say this, we are supporting, to Oliver's point, on international collaboration between trade unions in the United States and Europe and trade unions in Indonesia. There's a Dutch trade union that is working now with some of the Indonesian, with Serbundo and OPUK, some of these independent trade unions. I think that collaboration is very encouraging, to see these trade unions working together. So I think, yeah, we need smart, aggressive campaigning, but we also need to keep our eye on the ball. And the ball is that we need real trade unions and trade union power to offset the company power at the plantation level. That is frankly the long-term answer, I believe.
Yeah, I agree with the comments made. I don't think there's anything in the RSPO that goes against the formation of labor unions. Actually, in the standard, we ask for the rights of workers and labor to form labor unions to be respected. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if possibly these are ways of tackling the issue that we could go in parallel instead mm-hmm. of being one instead of the other. Yeah. Since OPUK and Serbundo were mentioned, for example, in the labor task force of the RSPO, we have had feedback from labor unions, and that's something that we're trying to improve as we go along to make sure that labor unions are more and more included within the RSPO system. And I also agree that maybe it's dealing with the businesses and within the supply chain is not the only way. But I think it's dangerous to think that there's one silver bullet that we have to solve the issues that we need to tackle in the production of commodities globally, or in agriculture, whatever you want to call it.
But aren't you saying that yourself? I mean, you've said it a few times now. We shouldn't, okay, the system's not perfect, but it's basically the only system that we have, so we shouldn't ditch it and stuff. So it seems to me that you are basically saying this is the only the game in town, and I would say that NGOs or labor movements should not just think about how to engage with the RSPO. That's not the only way you can push for human rights and labor rights in the plantation.
Sorry, Oliver, if I've given that impression. Maybe it's because I work in this one, so I'm I'm concentrating in the RSPO, and I don't think it's the only system. But when we look at this system, and if you ask me if we should ditch it to not have anything else, then I would tell you I would disagree. If you tell me we need to have other systems on the side of RSPO that tackle the same issues, by all means, I don't see why not. At the end of the day, we're all working towards the same goal. And what we need to make sure is we don't have systems that go one against the other. And I don't think this is the case in the case of labor unions, stronger labor unions, and making sure that labor is better organized.
I mean, sorry to burst your bubble, but I think there will be, conflicts, especially when labor becomes more powerful in the palm oil industry and is capable of pushing through substantially high wages, then I think the management side will not be too happy about it. So I don't think it'll, most of your members will probably not actively support that.
That's what's happened in the RSPO since the beginning. We call it engagement. You can call it conflict, whatever. But there's different opinions, and the standard that have been agreed so far have been agreed by all members, not just by the industry. I like to underline that. They've been signed off by all members, including the NGOs that have worked on this. So that's why we have a standard today. But I agree on your point. I mean, there's going to be increasing conflicts, and unfortunately, the issues of the world are this, and they're going to be at a different scale than what we did before because of the number of people that we are talking about nowadays. And I agree.
We've discussed previously the responsibility of the government in terms of implementing certain, particularly in terms of laws, implementing certain laws and making sure that they're supposed to be applied and they're supposed to be respected. So what I wanted to ask you is, like, in those new solutions, particularly because I think Mr. Pai, you discussed this before, like the fact that there were labor unions that were affected by the Soweto government, and that were actually a lot of people were actually killed during those years. What I wanted to ask you was, what's the responsibility, or what could the government do, and what can the government, in a realistic point of view, what can the government do in such a situation in providing help in order to promote a better production of sustainable palm oil and a better respect of human rights, considering these labor unions? Do you think the government can help these labor unions? It has can have a good influence?
Well, as I said, I mean, if you look at politics in Indonesia, it's basically dominated by parties that are linked to big business. There is no independent labor party. The current president is fairly progressive, but he's linked to a party which is also very much connected to these kind of business interests. So I think the first thing that has to be done is in the realm of politics. So rather than thinking about what chocolate bar you're going to buy, if it's going to be this one or that one, we need to reorientate towards political strategy, political discussions around what should a government be doing. And I mean, it's the same in Europe. We have a rise of fascism and governments which are not pro-labor. So the question is, how can we develop a new kind of internationalist solidarity which can support the labor groups in Indonesia. We've discussed several of these smaller independent kind of initiatives, but I think they need support by labor unions in the global north, because they have this whole legacy, and Eric was explaining it, that in a lot of, especially in the palm oil industry, that a lot of the unions are company unions, are yellow unions. So there's I think there's a lot of initiatives where new approaches about organizing, about transnationalism, and if we can shift the balance of forces in Indonesia so that we do have a government which is more supportive of labor rights, then of course there's lots of things that a government could do. For example, there could be a system of government inspectors, labor inspectors, that do the auditing according to the legal criteria. Then, I mean, there are lots of things that can be done in the sustainability, in the environmental sustainability issues. And I think it's more of a question of understanding why these things are not being done at the moment. And there's been quite good work done on these ties between these, between government and business, and how that then influences, how much is implemented in terms of the legal requirements that are now in place, and also in terms of policy and new laws which are, are not being decided on.
I just want to make one comment. I think is that we've talked. I'm glad that actually we've talked a lot about the structural context and changes in in Indonesian labor and politics that are that I think are incredibly necessary for long-term change in the palm oil sector, and for sector-wide sustainability, and not just sort of islands of sustainability. And I think that's absolutely true. But one thing I do want to note is I think that even that if we look at the Indonesian palm sector, I think there's a lot of money being made. I think a lot of the palm oil growers, the companies they're making a lot of money. They're some of the richest people in Indonesia. They're some of the richest people in Malaysia. So my point is that there is enough money in the system to pay workers a living wage. There's enough money to make sure that workers have good housing, and to make sure that they have proper protective equipment, and to make sure that they're not using paraquat and other chemicals. It is as Oliver's pointed out, it is a matter of distribution. We can ask more of the growers, and we can know that they actually can afford it. Yeah, I think that's important to remind ourselves. They can do better, and we should be okay with demanding that they do better. So I'll end on that note.
Completely agree.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Savi, do you have any final comments?
Yeah, I think, well, I agree with what's been said, although I think that it's a shared responsibility. I do think that all the supply chain plays a role in sharing the cost of better practices and of better production. I think it's dangerous to point the finger at one player, because it allows the others to not do anything about it. So I would like to say that to me, everyone should do better, and we should all strive to do better, even us on this panel and everyone that is working on this, and to engage. And I also hope to see another discussion such as this, organized by you, Simon, or by your organization, maybe on soy or on beef or on other commodities. Because I think the danger here is that by discussing this and focusing on palm oil, that we will think that by changing the crop itself and the plant, we will deal with the issues. And especially if the audience that is looking is not an audience that is customized with the oil palm as a cultivation, they might think that it's just something that we can do away with. And I think that the corporations that are working on oil palm, however good or bad we think they are, they're going to be very quick at switching to something else, and are doing similar thing on other commodities if they're not behaving well. Or we can work with them and make them work better, not only on palm oil, but at a landscape level, hopefully, also through the work that the RSPO is doing and others are doing, and not only on palm oil, but on other commodities that are causing the issues that we've talked about very well with the other panelists today, well, or wherever you are in your time zone. And thank you again for the invitation.
Well,
and thank you for the good discussion Eric and Oliver.
No, thank you very much. Yes, we'll take this, like, I'm sure Social Justice Connection is going to continue doing this this kind of conference meeting, not just, as you said, on palm oil, but on other commodities which are that we see much more in our everyday lives here in Canada, for example, or it can be in Washington DC where Mr. Gottwald is, or in Germany where Mr. Pai is. So well, thank you very much for participating in this video conference. Like, I think it was really interesting. We discussed a few points which were really relevant to human rights in palm oil production in Indonesia, and we've also been discussing suggestions that I wasn't really sure we would be discussing. So particularly the question of labor unions and this idea of transnational labor unions that will maybe evolve in the next years, or that will evolve, as you say, Mr. Pai, in the next years, that will have a major change in human rights issues in terms of palm oil in Indonesia, and probably in other sectors, since labor unions will not strictly be with regards to palm oil. So thank you all for your time, and I hope I'll see you in another video conference if possible.